The mating feast was a symphony of dread, and Verity was its central, silent note. Gilded tapestries depicting legendary hunts and epic battles did little to warm the cavernous stone hall. The air, thick with the scents of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the cloying musk of hundreds of powerful wolves, felt heavy in her lungs, a suffocating blanket of everything she was not. She was a ghost at this banquet of predators, a pale, scentless anomaly in a world defined by visceral instinct and primal aroma. Her Aunt Morwenna's grip was a vice on her arm, the woman's painted nails digging into the thin fabric of Verity's borrowed gown. The dress was the color of faded lavender, a washed-out shade for a washed-out girl. It was meant to make her look docile, pliable. It only made her feel invisible. "Smile, Verity," Morwenna hissed, her voice a venomous whisper against the roar of the crowd. "Lord Valerius is watching. You will not ruin this for our house." Our house, Verity thought with a bitter internal twist. There was no our. There was only Morwenna's ambition, a ravenous thing that had been feeding on Verity's future since the day her parents had perished in the borderland skirmishes, leaving her an orphan in her aunt's cruel care. Verity's gaze drifted unwillingly toward Lord Valerius Vanthorne. He was a thick-necked brute with small, greedy eyes that roamed over her as if she were a prize mare at auction. A wet sheen of sweat beaded on his upper lip, and the scent that rolled off him, a rancid mix of arrogance and unbathed wolf, made her stomach clench. He raised his goblet to her, a smirk stretching his fleshy mouth. He was the price of her aunt's ascension, the key to forging an alliance with the powerful but notoriously savage Vanthorne clan. And Verity was the currency, the high alpha of their territory. A grizzled old wolf named Lord Greymark had sanctioned this feast, this grotesque marketplace of alliances and bloodlines. But Verity had no bloodline to speak of, not one that anyone could detect. She was a dud, a blank. In a society where a wolf's scent was their soul's signature, she had none. It was a source of deep shame, a stain that had marked her as an outcast, a pariah whispered about in corridors and mocked in training yards. Morwenna had cultivated this shame, weaponized it, using it to isolate Verity until this single, awful purpose was all she had left. Her friend Tess, a servant girl with kind eyes and a perpetually worried frown, caught her gaze from across the hall. Tess gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea for Verity to endure. But endurance felt like a slow death. Every beat of the celebratory drums was a hammer blow against the cage of her ribs. Lord Valerius pushed his chair back with a loud scrape that drew a pocket of silence around his table. He was going to make his proposal, publicly. To refuse would bring catastrophic dishonor upon Morwenna, and the punishment for that would be unthinkable. To accept was to chain herself to that leering, monstrous man for the rest of her days. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the numb dread. It was a physical thing, a shard of ice in her heart. Her breath hitched, her vision narrowed. The roaring hall, the flickering torchlight, the predatory smiles, it all blurred into a swirling nightmare. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She pulled against her aunt's grip, a weak, desperate tug. "I can't," she whispered, the words swallowed by the din. Morwenna's fingers tightened, a brutal warning. "You will." But the ice shard of panic was melting into a frantic, molten fire. Flight. The primal instinct she'd been told she lacked screamed through her. Run! She wrenched her arm free with a strength that surprised them both. Morwenna stumbled back, her face a mask of shocked fury. Verity didn't wait. She turned and fled, plunging into the throng of bodies. She pushed past nobles in their fine silks and warriors in their dark leathers, their surprised grunts and curses lost to the roaring in her ears. She was a mouse scurrying through a forest of wolves, and the hunter was at her back. "Seize her!" Morwenna's shriek cut through the noise, sharp and clear. Hands reached for her, but she was small and quick, fueled by a terror so pure it was its own form of strength. She dodged and weaved, her borrowed gown tearing on a warrior's belt buckle. She didn't know where she was going, only away. Away from Valerius's leer, away from her aunt's cage. Then she saw him. He was standing near the great hearth, away from the main crush of the feast, a pillar of shadow against the fire's glow. He was not celebrating. He was observing, his presence a void of stillness in the chaotic swirl of the hall. He was massive, built on a scale that seemed to defy the confines of the room, with shoulders as broad as a mountain ledge and hair as black as a starless night. He wore no finery, only simple, dark clothing that did nothing to hide the sheer, brutal power coiled in his frame. No one stood near him. No one spoke to him. It was as if a circle of reverent fear had been drawn around him. He was a stranger, but he was also an anchor in the storm of her panic. Without thinking, driven by an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she changed course. She ran toward the stillness, toward the shadow. She reached him, her lungs burning, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and she grabbed his arm. His arm was like granite under her trembling fingers. Solid, immovable, real. The contact sent a jolt through her, a startling electric shock of heat that traveled from her hand all the way to the core of her being. And then the world stopped. The drums ceased. The laughter died. The roaring din of the feast collapsed into a silence so profound it was like the world holding its breath. Every sound, every movement ceased in an instant. Verity looked up, bewildered by the sudden quiet. She met his eyes. They were not the cool silver or flat brown of the wolves she knew. They were gold. Molten, luminous gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to see past her skin, past her bones, and directly into the hollowed-out spaces of her soul. In their depths, she saw something flare. Recognition. A flash of incandescent possession that was terrifying and absolute. A soft gasp rippled through the hall. And then, as one, every person in the great hall, Lord Greymark, the haughty nobles, the hulking warriors, the serving staff, even the repulsive Lord Valerius, who had been striding after her, dropped. They dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in a wave of universal, unquestioning submission. The entire hall, a vast congregation of some of the most powerful wolves on the continent, was kneeling. Kneeling to the man whose arm she was still desperately clutching. Her mind reeled, unable to process the scene. Why? Who was he? What was happening? She stared at his face, at the hard line of his jaw, and the severe, beautiful cut of his mouth. A low sound rumbled in his chest, a growl of such deep and primal resonance that she felt it vibrate through her own bones. It was not a sound of anger. It was a sound of finality. He looked down at her, his molten gaze softening for a fraction of a second, though the searing intensity never wavered. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, dark timbre that sliced through the absolute silence. It was not a shout, but it carried the weight of undisputed command, a voice that every wolf in their blood was born to obey. You came to me seeking a shield, little wolf, he declared, his eyes locked on hers, the words echoing in the vast, silent space. Instead, you have found your throne. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible and yet terrifyingly significant. Throne? Her? The scentless, worthless outcast? It made no sense. A choked, sputtering sound came from across the room. Lord Valerius was on one knee, his face purple with rage and confusion. Morwenna was kneeling too, her expression a rictus of horror and disbelief, her eyes fixed on Verity's hand gripping the stranger's arm. This man, this king of shadows, slowly covered her hand with his own. His touch was a brand, a searing claim that sent another dizzying shockwave of heat through her. The world tilted on its axis, the last vestiges of her panic giving way to a profound, soul-deep bewilderment. Who are you? She managed to whisper, her voice thin and reedy. His gaze swept the hall, a silent dismissal that was more potent than any command. I am Ronan, he said, his voice for her ears alone now. The name struck a chord deep within her, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. Ronan, the Alpha King, the reclusive, brutal ruler of all the territories, who had not been seen at a regional gathering in over a decade. He was a myth, a monster from a fireside tale used to frighten pups, and she had just run to him for help. The feast is over, Ronan announced, his voice once again rolling with absolute authority. People scrambled to their feet, not daring to meet his eyes, and began to file out of the hall in a silent, hasty exodus. They moved with the cowed urgency of those in the presence of a god. Your Majesty, Lord Vanthorne stammered, finally finding his voice. There is a misunderstanding. This girl, she is promised to me. An arrangement with her aunt, House Thorne. Ronan didn't even glance at him. His golden eyes remained fixed on Verity. There is no misunderstanding, he said, the words laced with a chilling finality. There is only what is mine. Mine. The word was a physical blow, a declaration that resonated in a place deeper than her ears. It was a brand on her soul. Morwenna surged forward, her face pale with fury. King Ronan, with all respect, she is my niece. She is a nobody, a scentless defect. She has nothing to offer you. This is a mistake. Ronan finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. The full force of his molten gaze fell upon Morwenna, and Verity felt her aunt flinch as if struck. The air grew cold, heavy with a palpable menace. You kept her from me, he stated, not a question but a judgment. You cloaked her in shame and tried to sell her like cattle. For that, you will answer. But not tonight. He looked toward his beta, a scarred warrior who had materialized at his side. Garrett, see them out. They are not welcome in my fortress. Garrett, a man nearly as imposing as Ronan himself, nodded sharply. My king. He moved toward Morwenna and a still protesting Valerius, his presence an unspoken threat that was more than enough to force their retreat. The hall was emptying rapidly, leaving only the three of them in the vast, echoing space. Verity's knees felt weak. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a trembling exhaustion in its wake. She tried to pull her hand away from his, but his grip was gentle yet unbreakable. What is happening? She asked again, her voice trembling. What do you mean, throne? I don't understand. You will, he said softly, his thumb tracing a pattern over the back of her hand, sending shivers across her skin. He began to lead her away from the dying embers of the feast, toward a dark, stone corridor she had never seen before. I am taking you somewhere safe. My home. Your home? She balked, trying to plant her feet. I can't go with you. I don't even know you. He stopped and turned to face her fully. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, a living mountain of muscle and power. Yet his eyes, those burning gold eyes, held a strange, raw vulnerability she couldn't decipher. It was as if he was looking at a miracle, at something he had waited an eternity to find. My wolf knew you the moment I walked into that hall, he said, his voice low and guttural. He has been howling your name since I was a boy, a name I did not know until I saw your face. You are not a nobody. You are not a defect. He lifted her hand, his gaze dropping to their joined fingers. You are my mate, and your home is with me, now and always. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Mate, the sacred, unbreakable, fated bond. It was the dream of every she-wolf, the core of their existence. But it couldn't be true. Not for her. The scentless, the broken. How could he, the Alpha King, be mated to her? It was impossible. A cruel joke. Her mind, already reeling, simply shut down. The stone floor seemed to rush up to meet her as her vision dissolved into a swirl of black. The last thing she felt before consciousness fled was the solid, unyielding strength of Ronan's arms catching her, pulling her tight against his chest, as if he would never let her go. Verity awoke to the scent of dried herbs and old parchment. She was lying in a bed so vast it felt like a field of snow, the linens softer than anything she had ever touched. A thick fur pelt was draped over her, warm and heavy. The room was circular, its walls lined with towering shelves crammed with books. A single large window looked out not upon a courtyard or forest, but upon an endless expanse of clouds. They were in the sky. Panic fluttered in her chest, a caged bird beating its wings. She sat up, the fur sliding away. She was still in the tattered lavender gown. Memories of the feast, of grabbing his arm, of the entire world kneeling crashed down on her. Heavens, girl, lie still. You gave us all a fright. The voice was raspy but kind. An old woman sat in a worn armchair by a crackling fire, her hands busy grinding something in a stone mortar. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were bright and sharp. She had the faint, clean scent of willow bark and healing balms. "Where am I?" Verity asked, her voice hoarse. "You are in the king's spire, at the heart of the citadel," the woman said, not looking up from her work. "The safest place in all the territories. I am Elspeth, the king's healer." The king. Ronan. The memory of his golden eyes, his possessive touch, sent a tremor through her. He said I was his mate. The words felt foreign and absurd on her tongue. Elspeth finally looked up, her gaze knowing and sympathetic. "The bond does not lie, child. It is the oldest and truest of our magics. The Alpha King has been without his mate for all his life. A king without his queen is an incomplete soul, a kingdom without its heart. Our lands have suffered for it. But I can't be," Verity insisted, the denial a desperate shield. "I have no scent. I'm broken." A faint smile touched Elspeth's lips. "Broken? Oh no, little one. Not broken. Hidden." She set her mortar aside and rose, her movements slow but steady. She came to the bedside and reached out a gnarled hand, stopping just short of touching Verity's forehead. May I? Verity hesitated, then gave a small nod. Elspeth's fingers, surprisingly warm, pressed against her temple. The healer closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Verity felt a strange, gentle probing in her mind, like a soft breeze stirring through a long-shuttered room. After a long moment, Elspeth pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with a dawning awe. "By the ancient moons," she breathed, "it is true. The old blood runs in you." "What blood? What are you talking about?" "You are not scentless because you lack a wolf, child," Elspeth explained, her voice filled with a new reverence. "You are scentless because your power is a void, a perfect stillness that absorbs all scent, all magic around it. It is the signature of the luminary bloodline." Luminary. The word was a whisper from the oldest legends, a bloodline of females with the power to anchor and amplify the magic of their mates and their lands. They were said to be the living hearts of the kingdom, their presence ensuring prosperity, their absence bringing blight and decay. A bloodline thought to have been wiped out centuries ago. "That's impossible," Verity whispered, shaking her head. "My parents were simple border guards, from a minor house." "They hid you," a deep voice said from the doorway. Ronan stood there, filling the frame, his presence sucking the air from the room. He had changed into a simple black tunic and trousers, but it did nothing to diminish his intimidating aura. His golden eyes were fixed on her, a mixture of hunger and something that looked shockingly like relief. "They knew what you were. They knew what vultures like your aunt or the Vanthorns would do to get their hands on a luminary. So they bound your power, hid you in plain sight in a house they thought too insignificant to notice, and prayed you would remain undiscovered." He walked into the room, his every step deliberate and silent. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his gaze never leaving her face. "The binding was meant to break when you came of age, but it was woven too tightly. It would have taken the jolt of a fated bond to shatter it. The moment you touched me, the binding cracked. My wolf didn't just recognize his mate. He recognized the soul of the kingdom he's been trying to hold together with sheer will." Verity stared at him, her world fracturing and reforming into a shape she didn't recognize. Everything she had ever known about herself, her shame, her worthlessness, was a lie, a carefully constructed cage. Her parents hadn't abandoned her. They had tried to protect her. And her aunt had known. She must have. "She knew," Verity said aloud, the realization a cold stone in her gut. "Morwenna. She wasn't just marrying me off for an alliance. She was selling a legend she couldn't access herself. And for that, she will pay a heavy price." Ronan growled, the sound a low vibration of promised violence. He turned his gaze back to her, and the raw fury softened into that same unsettling reverence. "But that is for later. Now, you are here. You are safe." Safe. She was in a tower at the top of the world, with a man who was a living legend of terror and power, who claimed she was his fated mate and the long-lost heir to a magical bloodline. It didn't feel safe. It felt like she had traded one cage for another, albeit a much larger and more opulent one. "I need you to understand, Verity," he said, taking a step closer. "For years, my power has been a raw, untamed storm. I have held this kingdom together through fear and force because its heart was missing. You. The bond between us. It is not a choice. It is a necessity. For me." For our people. He sat on the edge of the bed, and despite his size, the movement was careful, as if he were afraid of startling her. The mattress dipped under his weight, bringing him closer. The sheer heat radiating from him was a tangible force. "I will not hurt you," he murmured, his voice a low thrum that vibrated deep inside her chest. "I will give you anything you desire. Jewels, gowns, armies, but I will not let you go. I cannot." The finality in his tone was absolute. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. She was his. The bond had declared it. The king had decreed it. Her mind screamed in protest, a rebellion against this sudden, total loss of agency. But another part of her, a deep, neglected part that had starved for connection her entire life, felt a strange, treacherous pull toward the certainty in his golden eyes. A pull toward the raw, possessive heat of his presence. The days that followed were a blur of luxurious confinement. Ronan was true to his word. He gave her a wardrobe filled with gowns of silk and velvet in every color of the rainbow, jewels that glittered with an inner fire, and meals that were feasts in themselves, served in her private chambers. The spire was hers to command, a gilded cage with a breathtaking view. She spent hours in the circular library, her fingers tracing the spines of ancient books, searching for any mention of the luminary line. She found them in dusty tomes of prophecy. The luminaries were described not as warriors, but as anchors. Their magic didn't create fire or ice. It nurtured, stabilized, and amplified the magic of the alpha it was bonded to. A luminary queen meant fertile lands, strong pups, and a pack whose power was unified and unbreakable. Without its luminary, a kingdom would slowly fray at the edges, the Alpha King's power becoming a destructive force rather than a protective one, turning inward on itself and its people. It explained the hushed rumors she'd heard her whole life about King Ronan's reign, of his brutal temper, the harshness of his laws, the feral madness that was said to claim wolves on the kingdom's fringes. He wasn't just a tyrant by nature. He was a king whose soul was slowly tearing itself apart. Ronan, for his part, kept a respectful distance, yet his presence was a constant hum beneath the surface of her new reality. He would appear in the library doorway while she was reading, simply watching her with an unnerving stillness. He would join her for meals, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. He never pushed, never demanded, but his eyes followed her every move, a burning, possessive gaze that made her skin prickle. The bond was a constant, unsettling presence. It was a faint thrumming in her blood, a low-level awareness of him, even when he was rooms away. Sometimes, a wave of emotion that was not her own would wash over her. A flash of cold fury when he was dealing with a disloyal courtier. A pang of deep, aching loneliness that she felt in the dead of night. It was an invasion, a violation of the sanctity of her own mind. 1 week after the feast, the first true test arrived. Garrett appeared before the king in the throne room, a vast chamber of polished black stone where Verity had been summoned to sit on a smaller yet still imposing throne beside Ronan's. "Your Majesty," Garrett said, bowing low. "Word from the southern territories. The Van Thorns are stirring dissent. They spread tales of a false mate, a scentless waif you've claimed in a fit of madness. They are rallying the smaller houses, whispering that your grip on the throne is failing." A low growl vibrated from Ronan's chest. The air in the throne room dropped several degrees. "They dare? They are emboldened by their public humiliation, my king. and by your long absence from the regions. They see this as an opportunity." Ronan's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at Verity, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. The need to go, to crush this rebellion with his own hands, warring with his desperate refusal to leave her side. "I have to go," he said, the words tight with anger. "I will leave my royal guard. You will not be left unprotected for a moment." A cold dread washed over her, and for a moment she couldn't tell if the feeling was hers or his, channeled through the bond. "For how long?" she asked, her voice small. "No more than 3 days," he promised, his golden eyes boring into hers. "I will ride hard, make an example of one of their puppet lords, and return." The night before he left, he came to her chambers. He didn't speak, merely stood before her, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire room. The turmoil rolling off him was a palpable force. Without a word, he reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure energy that made her gasp. "This," he said, his voice a rough whisper, "being away from you. It will feel like my soul is being flayed. The bond is incomplete. It will scream for you." She could only stare at him, mesmerized by the raw pain in his eyes. This was the first crack she had seen in his impenetrable facade. The mighty Alpha King was afraid of leaving her, afraid of the agony the separation would cause. "Be safe," she found herself whispering, the words surprising her. A muscle in his jaw clenched. "I will burn the world to the ground to get back to you," he vowed. And then he was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical weight. The fortress, which had felt like a cage, now felt empty. Terribly, frighteningly empty. The first day was manageable. Verity buried herself in the library, trying to distract herself from the constant, low-grade ache that had settled in her chest. It was a phantom pain, a hollowness that echoed the space he had left behind. By the second night, the ache had become a gnawing agony. She couldn't sleep. She paced her chambers like a caged animal, her own anxiety tangled with the sharp, violent flashes of his. Through the frayed tether of the bond, she felt his rage, the thrill of a hunt, the cold satisfaction of justice delivered. She saw flashes of a moonlit forest through his eyes, felt the wind in his hair as he rode. It was disorienting and terrifying. She was lying in bed, staring at the canopy, when the dream came. It wasn't a dream. It was a vision. She was standing in a burning village, the scent of ash and blood thick in the air. Ronan stood before a cowering lord, his face a mask of cold fury, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. "You chose the wrong side," his voice echoed in her mind, and she felt the chilling finality of his judgment as if it were her own. She woke with a gasp, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of a sword hilt in her own hand. The bond was a two-way street of torment. If she felt this, what was he feeling? Was her fear, her loneliness, bleeding into him as he fought? Was she a weakness he carried into battle? He returned late on the third night, a whirlwind of dust and cold night air. He didn't send for her. He came directly to the library where she'd taken refuge. He looked haggard, his face grim and streaked with dirt, but his eyes were blazing gold as they found her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just before her. He didn't touch her, but the raw need coming off him was so potent it made her dizzy. It was worse than I imagined, he rasped, his voice raw. Like a part of me was missing, a constant, clawing emptiness. He finally broke, his composure shattering. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his touch both desperate and exquisitely gentle. I felt your fear. It nearly drove me mad. This was his vulnerability, laid bare. Not the fearsome alpha king, but a man terrified of the chasm that had opened between them. In that moment, he wasn't her captor. He was her other half, suffering as she was. I felt your anger, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I saw the village. His eyes closed for a second. A deep shudder ran through his massive frame. I have a kingdom at my feet, Verity. Power that can break mountains. And none of it means anything when I am not with you. It is a curse. Only you make it a gift. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her skin. She could feel the frantic, pounding beat of his heart. Or maybe it was her own. I will never leave you again, he vowed. Never. The raw honesty of his confession shattered something within her. The fear, the resentment, they didn't vanish, but they were joined by something new, a fragile, tentative flicker of understanding, of connection. She didn't lift her arms to embrace him, but she didn't pull away either. For the first time, she simply stood there, letting his presence, his pain, his desperate need for her, wash over her. The fragile peace born of Ronan's vulnerable return was shattered less than a week later. He was called to an emergency council meeting in the lower levels of the Citadel, a dispute between two border pacts that threatened to erupt into open war. He had wanted to bring her, but the council chamber was no place for her yet. Not until their bond was formally announced and accepted. He left her with Garrett and a dozen of his most elite guards stationed outside her spire. No one enters. No one leaves. Understood? Ronan's command to his beta had been absolute, his golden eyes dark with a familiar reluctance to leave her. Verity watched him go from the high window, the ache of their temporary separation already a familiar thrum in her blood. She tried to settle with a book, but the words swam before her eyes. A deep, primal unease had settled over her, a feeling of being watched that had nothing to do with the guards outside her door. The fire in the hearth suddenly sputtered and hissed, the flames shrinking to a pale, sickly blue. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, the familiar scent of old parchment and wood smoke replaced by something cloying and bitter, the scent of Morwenna's ambition. Verity's head snapped up. She was on her feet in an instant, her heart hammering against her ribs. A section of the stone wall near the tapestry of the winter hunt shimmered, the solid rock turning translucent. A secret passage. Her aunt's family, House Thorne, had served as stewards of the citadel centuries ago. They knew its secrets. Morwenna stepped through the phantom wall, and the stone solidified behind her. She was not alone. Two hulking guards flanked her, their faces grim, their wolfish scent tainted with the sour note of betrayal. They were not Ronan's men. "You have been a great deal of trouble, niece," Morwenna said, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. Her eyes, small and hard like chips of obsidian, raked over Verity, taking in the fine silk of her lounging robes. "Look at you, playing the queen in your stolen tower. Did you really think he would keep you? A scentless little stray?" "He knows what I am," Verity said, her voice shaking but defiant. She backed away, her hand reaching for a heavy silver letter opener on the writing desk. A pathetic weapon, but it was something. Morwenna let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, I know he does. The Alpha King is not a fool. He knows you are a luminary, and that, my dear, is a prize far too valuable to be wasted on one man. Her expression turned predatory. A luminary's blood, properly harvested, can grant a lesser wolf a measure of her power. Imagine what an alliance of houses, all fortified by your essence, could achieve. We could build a new dynasty, one that doesn't kneel to a half-mad king. Her plan was monstrous, not to sell her, but to drain her, to turn her into a living battery for her own traitorous ambitions. You're insane, Verity breathed, her back hitting the cold stone of the far wall. She was trapped. Garrett and the guards were outside, but they wouldn't hear. The walls of the spire were too thick. I am practical, Morwenna corrected, taking a step forward. He keeps you here as an anchor for his own power. I will share you with the world, for the right price. She nodded to her guards. Take her. Be careful not to mark her face. It's her only asset. The two brutes advanced. The small, desperate flicker of defiance inside Verity roared into a bonfire. She had not survived the mating feast, had not discovered the truth of her own existence, only to be bled dry like an animal by this venomous creature. She would not be a victim again. As the first guard reached for her, a scream of pure, undiluted rage tore from her throat. It was a soundless scream, a psychic blast of terror and fury, and with it something inside her snapped. The fragile bindings around her power, the ones Ronan's touch had merely cracked, shattered completely. A wave of raw, untamed energy erupted from her. It was not fire or force, but pure, blinding white light. It exploded outward in a silent concussion of power, slamming into the advancing guards. They were thrown backward, as if struck by a battering ram, their heads cracking against the stone wall with a sickening thud. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Morwenna staggered back, her arm thrown up to shield her eyes from the incandescent glow radiating from Verity. What is this?" she stammered, her composure finally breaking, revealing the naked greed and fear beneath. Verity stood panting, the light slowly receding, leaving shimmering motes dancing in the air around her. She felt drained, but also utterly, thrillingly alive. She had done that. That power was hers. Miles away, in the stuffy confines of the council chamber, Ronan froze mid-sentence. A psychic scream of pure, unadulterated terror, Verity's terror, had ripped through the bond. It was followed by a colossal, explosive surge of unfamiliar power that felt like a star being born inside his own soul. Verity. He didn't say a word. He didn't dismiss the council. He simply turned, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he was gone. Not a man, but a blur of shadow and fury. The air in the council room crackled with the ozone of his abrupt departure. He moved through the Citadel's corridors not as a king, but as a predator. His human form was too slow. In a deserted hallway, he shed his skin, the sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh, a brutal symphony of transformation. His wolf form was immense, a creature of nightmare and legend, larger than any living wolf, with fur as black as pitch and eyes that burned like twin coals of molten gold. He bounded up the spire's winding stairs, a force of nature unleashed. He smelled the foreign wolves, the stench of their betrayal a poison in his sanctum. He smelled Morwenna's bitter scent, and he smelled Verity's terror. Back in the chamber, Morwenna recovered from her shock, her eyes gleaming with a manic light. "So, the little mouse has claws," she hissed, pulling a long, slender knife from a sheath hidden in her skirts. The blade gleamed with the unmistakable, deadly sheen of silver. No matter. A drained luminary is just as useful as a live one. She lunged. Verity cried out, stumbling backward, the last of her strength gone. The silver blade sliced through the air, aimed straight for her heart. The door to the chamber didn't open. It exploded inward, ripped from its stone hinges as if it were paper. Ronan, in his terrifying, magnificent wolf form, filled the doorway. His lips were peeled back from teeth like daggers, and a growl of apocalyptic rage shook the very foundations of the tower. His golden eyes locked on the scene, Morwenna, the silver knife, and the terror on Verity's face. Time seemed to slow. He saw the arc of the blade. He saw his mate, his queen, his entire world, threatened. He was no longer a king. He was a storm. He was vengeance. He crossed the room in a single, impossible bound, a black-furred comet of death. He hit Morwenna not with his teeth, but with the full, brutal force of his body. The impact sent her flying across the room. The silver knife clattered harmlessly against the stones. Morwenna slammed into the far wall and collapsed in a broken heap, groaning. Ronan didn't spare her a second glance. His entire focus was on Verity. He skidded to a halt before her, the monstrous wolf nudging her gently with his massive head, a low, questioning whine rumbling in his chest. He circled her, his body a living wall of protective fury, his burning eyes scanning every inch of her, searching for injury. He was a monster, a killer, the most terrifying creature she had ever seen. And in that moment, Verity had never felt so safe in her entire life. She reached out a trembling hand and buried her fingers in the thick, dark fur of his ruff, anchoring herself to his solid, furious, wonderful presence. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Garrett and the royal guard, alerted by the cataclysmic sound of Ronan's transformation and the destruction of the chamber door, swarmed the spire. Morwenna and her unconscious guards were dragged away to the deepest dungeons, their fate a foregone conclusion. But the victory felt hollow. The attack had exposed a chilling truth. Ronan's fortress was not impregnable. Morwenna had found a way in. Others could too. The threat was not just a distant rumor in the south. It was here, inside the walls of her gilded cage. That night, a new plan was forged in the crucible of fear and fury. Morwenna, under brutal interrogation, had confessed her entire plot. Her betrayal ran deep, a web of conspirators and sympathizers, all united by their hatred of Ronan's iron-fisted rule and their greed for the power Verity represented. And she'd revealed one last, venomous piece of leverage. "She has Tess," Verity whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. They were in Ronan's private study, a stark room of black wood and maps. The memory of Morwenna's gloating confession, delivered by Garrett, was a fresh wound. "My friend, from the feast. Morwenna's agents took her from the village. They're holding her in the old Thorn estate, just beyond the city." Ronan stood by the window, staring out at the night. The rage still radiated from him in palpable waves. "It's a trap, Verity. She's using your friend as bait to lure you out." "I know," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of hard-won strength. "And it's going to work. I'm going." He whirled around, his golden eyes flashing with fire. "Absolutely not. I will send Garrett and 100 of my best warriors. They will tear that estate down to its foundations. You will remain here, where you are safe. And they will kill Tess the moment they see your banners," Verity countered, standing to face him. The terror of the assault had been burned away. leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding steel. She was done being protected. She was done being a pawn. Morwenna wants me. She doesn't expect me to come alone. She doesn't expect me to come at all. She expects you. But if I go, I might be able to get close, to save her. It's suicide, he growled, stalking toward her. I forbid it. You can't, she shot back, her chin lifted in defiance. For the first time, she did not shrink from his anger. She met it head on. She is my friend. This is my fault. My power is what put her in danger. I will not hide in this tower while she suffers for me. They stood inches apart, a stalemate of immovable will and unstoppable force. The air crackled with their conflicting intentions. He was the Alpha King, his word was law, but she was his mate, the other half of his soul, and he was discovering that her will was as formidable as his own. He stared at her, his expression a war of fury, fear, and a dawning, grudging respect. Then I will go with you, he said finally, his voice rough. Not as a king with an army, just me and you. The Thorn estate was a place of shadows and decay, a crumbling manor that brooded under a sliver of moon. They moved through the dying woods like ghosts, Ronan in his human form, a living shadow at her side, and Verity, her senses preternaturally sharp, a side effect of her awakened power. The bond between them was a taut wire, humming with shared purpose and unspoken fear. They found Tess in the estate's cavernous, dust-choked great hall. She was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face pale and tear-streaked, and standing over her, a silver dagger to her throat, was not Morwenna, but Lord Valerius Vanthorn. A dozen Vanthorn guards were arrayed around the room, their expressions a mixture of triumph and unease. The little mouse comes for the cheese, Valerius sneered, his greedy eyes fixing on Verity. And she brings the mad king with her. How convenient. Ronan's hand went to the hilt of his sword, a low growl starting in his chest. One move, your majesty, Valerius warned, pressing the dagger harder against Tess's skin. And the serving girl bleeds. Morwenna may have failed, but the Vanthorns will not. The luminary will be ours. We will break the bond, chain you, and build our empire on your power. Verity's eyes were locked on Tess's terrified face. This was it. The culmination of all the fear, all the running. She had to act, not as a victim, but as a queen. Let her go, Valerius, Verity said, her voice ringing with a strange new authority. It didn't tremble. It commanded. She took a step forward, into the center of the room. And why would I do that? He mocked. Because you want me, she said simply. Here I am. A profound calm settled over her. The frantic energy of her first power surge was gone, replaced by a deep, steady well of strength. She could feel it inside her, a sun waiting to rise. She looked at Ronan, a silent communication passing between them through the bond. Trust me, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his hand dropping from his sword. His trust was a gift, a final piece of armor she needed. Verity closed her eyes. She reached inward, not for the wild, explosive panic of before, but for the still, quiet center of her power. The void, the anchor, the heart of the luminary. She felt the ancient magic of her bloodline answer the call. It wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a force of pure order, of fundamental truth. When she opened her eyes, they were no longer just green. They were glowing with a soft, internal luminescence, a steady white light. The air in the hall grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with wolfish rage. The ancient carved runes on the stone walls of the estate, dormant for centuries, began to flicker with a sympathetic light, just as they had in Ronan's fortress. The Vanthorn guards shifted uneasily, their wolves whining in their minds, confused by this strange, scentless magic. "What is this sorcery?" Valerius snarled, his bravado faltering. "This is my birthright," Verity declared. The light emanating from her intensified, not in a blinding flash, but in a steady, inexorable wave. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. A nova in human form. The power threatened to overwhelm her, a tidal wave of pure energy that felt like it could tear her apart, dissolve her very being. It was too much, too vast. "I have you, Verity." Ronan's voice echoed in her mind, a solid, unbreakable anchor in the raging storm of her own power. "I am your anchor. Hold on to me." His strength, his love, his absolute faith in her poured through the bond, giving her a focus she desperately needed. She wasn't just Verity anymore. They were two halves of a single whole. His stability gave her control. She focused the light. She didn't push it out as a weapon. She drew it in. The wave of nullification was not an attack, but a reclamation. She targeted the very essence of what made them wolves. Valerius screamed, a raw animal sound of agony and disbelief. He dropped the dagger and clutched his chest, his body convulsing. The other guards cried out, stumbling back, their faces contorted in pain. They were not being physically harmed. Something far worse was happening. The potent, musky scent of their wolf spirits was being erased, pulled from them, absorbed into the perfect luminous void that was Verity. They could feel their inner beasts shrinking, shriveling, dying. In a matter of seconds, it was over. Valerius collapsed to his knees, no longer a proud alpha heir, but a terrified, powerless man, the savage fire in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The Vanthorn guards were the same, their connection to their wolves severed, leaving them weak, broken, and fundamentally less than they had been. In a world of predators, she had rendered them prey. Ronan moved then, a blur of speed, cutting Tess free and pulling her to safety. He turned to face the kneeling, broken men, his sword now in his hand. But Verity held up a hand. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. The light around her was fading, her power settling back into a gentle, steady hum. "Death is too kind. Let them live with what they have lost. Let them be a message to any others who would seek to use me." Ronan looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the queenly authority in her posture. His eyes, his burning golden eyes, were filled with an emotion that went beyond possession, beyond need. It was pure, unadulterated adoration. They left the Vanthorns to their fate, to be discovered by their rivals as powerless husks, a fate worse than any execution. Back in the citadel, in the great hall where she had first grabbed his arm, the silence was profound. The ordeal was over. The traitors were broken. The kingdom was secure. Ronan led her to the center of the hall, to the spot where their journey had begun. He didn't stand before her as a king. He knelt. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf on the continent, knelt before her on the cold stone floor, his head bowed. "You knelt before me in terror," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked up at her. "But it is I who have been brought to my knees, by your strength, your courage, your heart. He rose slowly, his hands coming up to cup her face. The bond is awakened. Your power is unleashed. But it is not yet complete. The final step must be taken. A formal claim. A merging of souls. She looked into his eyes, and she saw her future. Not a cage, but a partnership. Not a prison, but a throne. Shared with the man who was her anchor, her other half. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. A slow, beautiful smile transformed his face. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, just below her ear. "This will not hurt," he murmured. "It will make us whole." He bit down. Not a savage act of possession, but a sacred, tender seal. There was no pain, only a shattering, ecstatic explosion of pure light and energy. The bond slammed into place, complete and unbreakable. His memories, his loneliness, his centuries of waiting flooded her mind. Her history, her fear, her resilience, her newfound strength flooded his. They saw each other, truly and completely, soul to soul. "Mine," his mind whispered to hers. "Yours," she answered without hesitation. Months later, Verity stood on the highest balcony of the spire, the morning sun warming her face. The lands below were green and vibrant, the kingdom thriving under the steady, benevolent magic of its returned heart. She rested a hand on her gently swelling abdomen, a quiet smile on her lips. Inside her, two tiny heartbeats, two new sparks of magic, echoed her own. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and Ronan's solid presence was a familiar comfort. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand covering hers on her belly. "My queen," he murmured into her hair, his voice soft with a love that was now a constant, gentle song in her soul. She leaned back against him, looking out at their kingdom, at their future. She was no longer Verity, the scentless outcast. She was the luminary queen, the anchor of the Alpha King, a mother-to-be. She was home. "My king," she whispered back, her heart full. "My everything." Together, whole, finally. Thank you so much for listening to this story on His Wolf Knew First. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a new tale. Drop a comment below telling me which moment moved you the most. Your support truly means the world to me, and I'll see you in the next story on His Wolf Knew First.